Today I'm going to talk about genres, or maybe in video games it might be better to say that I'm going to talk about setting. When I mean settings, I mean things like science fiction and fantasy, post-apocalyptic, modern, western, steampunk, cyberpunk. Say 10 years ago, I had a order of accessibility for these settings that looked like this, with modern at the top, fantasy and steampunk at the bottom. And my opinion on that has actually changed. So now I actually believe that it looks more like this, where fantasy is actually up near the top. And actually modern moves pretty far down the list. Why do I think this? Let me walk through each of these settings, these genres, and talk about them one by one and see if the reason becomes clear. I'll circle back at the very end and talk through my thinking. Almost all fantasy settings are similar to each other. When someone comes to your fantasy game, they're basically starting here at Lord of the Rings. And then you are talking about the changes from Lord of the Rings. So Lord of the Rings is low fantasy, it's got elves and dwarves, and it's got a big long-term bad presence. That describes quite a few different video games. That's Dragon Age, that's The Witcher. So then all you're really having to do is describe the differences between your game and that Lord of the Rings baseline. If you don't have elves and dwarves, and you're maybe even lower fantasy, then you're Game of Thrones. If you don't have dwarves, but you have a bunch of different kinds of elves, then you're Elder Scrolls. For sort of Western fantasy, the reason why it's accessible at the end of the day is because you don't have to actually explain very much. The possibility space is pretty narrow. Now, this isn't true for some of the very high fantasy games that come out of Japan. There you have a lot more to explain. Though in these cases, you can often lean into Final Fantasy as your base case, because people that are playing your Japanese high fantasy RPG probably are familiar with the tropes of the Final Fantasy series. Similar with Westerns. Westerns have a clear, pretty narrow box that you understand. I'm going to probably ride a horse, and maybe there are trains, maybe there aren't trains. I'm going to shoot a gun, but it's not going to have a ton of bullets. I'm pretty much on my own from a law enforcement perspective. Again, the possibility space is pretty narrow. You can start with my preconceived notions and build upon that. I think it's worthwhile here when we're talking about Westerns to just quickly do an aside to World War I. World War I takes place immediately after the Western period, and it actually has a problem because people's preconceived notion of World War I is trench warfare. At least most people's preconceived notion, which doesn't seem like a great setting for a video game, does it? But this is actually something that allowed Battlefield V to really get people's expectations to crank up. When you came into that first trailer, your expectations, like mine, were probably pretty low. It's like, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to stand in a trench, we're going to have a very slow firing gun, and then what? I don't get it. But then that first trailer was still recognizable, but it reset your expectations. And that reset, that subversion of expectations actually got people extra excited. So just because someone has preconceived notions that aren't positive doesn't mean that you can't use those to actually increase expectation. Moving on to Post-Apocalypse. Post-Apocalypse actually has somewhat more problems than Western because you don't exactly know where the technology level is at, but most people kind of get it. It's kind of like a Western, but you can put some modern technology in there as you need to. Probably there are no cell phones. If there are cars, they're pretty limited in their use and they're relatively rare. Cyberpunk is like the modern day, but plus. So it has the advantage of, again, you are probably working outside of the law. You're probably a criminal or in the underground or in a resistance movement of some sort. It does require you to at least explain somewhat what your body modification system is, because I'm coming in with either not an understanding of that being part of the genre at all, or at least not a clear understanding of how it's going to work in your game. Something with Cyberpunk is that it can actually age really quickly. Because it's sort of set 15 minutes in the future, it's trying to establish what technology looks like not too far in the future. It can very quickly be passed by the present day. If you look at our modern world and compare it to what a cyberpunk setting from the 1980s looked like, from a technological perspective, we've passed it in a lot of ways, in terms of what the internet looks like, in terms of the power of computers. We don't have cybernetics at the same level that a cyberpunk setting has, but we've passed most of the other things. So something to be aware of is that it is going to age. And unlike a science fiction setting set way further in the future, it can also age pretty badly from the perspective of its cultural stuff. Things written in the 1980s often have these weird Japan-phobic stories. This is just something to keep in mind, is if you're setting something very close in the future, then when people come and look at it in the future, things that have aged badly are going to feel even worse than something that is set in a different time period, more broadly separated. Okay, so let's talk about modern. The biggest problem that modern video games have, and especially modern RPGs, is that you know pretty much exactly how the modern world works. And chances are that video game isn't going to be able to meet those expectations. You expect there to be smartphones and cars and plane travel. And in most cases, you expect there to be a functioning police force and there to be government that works. So it's not always exactly clear how your story, how your game fits within this setting. Now, of course, there's tons of video games that actually exist within the modern setting. All the sports games are set within a modern setting, and the military shooters are usually set within a modern setting. So how do they do it? Like with the things I've talked to before, they do it by narrowing the possibility space. You don't care about how the police force works in the sports game, and when you're doing the military shooter, then your expectation is that you're playing for the good guys and there is some sort of terrorist organization that you were fighting against. That's why actually the video game industry has to churn over its villains in these modern shooters, because as different groups come in and out of the news, different groups become acceptable or unacceptable to have as your standard bad guy. Something you're seeing in movies to get around some of the problems presented by our modern setting, like things like smartphones and the internet and social media, is, let's make up a term and call it 15 minutes in the past. Almost the flip side of the Cyberpunk Max Headroom setting, where you're actually setting the movie in an indeterminate recent past, a past that doesn't have smartphones everywhere, doesn't really have Facebook. It's usually not established what time period it really is, kind of late 90s-ish, I guess. So maybe there's a possibility there where you can go back in time, you can remove some of the problematic bits of technology that unwind all of your stakes, because someone can just call the police on a cell phone at any moment. Science fiction has the problem of not having that baseline expectation. So when you are playing your science fiction game, you have a bunch of questions that immediately spring to the player's mind. Is there faster than light travel? How does it work? Is it like warp speed? Is it like hyper jumps? Are there some sort of Stargate? Do I have standard guns? Do we have smartphones? Are there aliens? Are there not aliens? Unlike fantasy, which has that Tolkien base, science fiction doesn't really have that. You could go to Star Wars, which is more science fantasy, or you could go to Star Trek, which is more science fiction-y, or The Expanse, which is even a harder science fiction. But all of these actually answer those questions in different ways. Star Trek has warp speed, Star Wars has hyperdrive, The Expanse doesn't have fast and light travel, except that it has this gate network that allows movement between different worlds. The problem you have with science fiction is you just have a lot of establishment that's required for people to be able to understand your setting. And then finally, steampunk. I love steampunk. Steampunk is actually one of my favorite settings. I love the intricacy of the design. I love the way that it looks, but it isn't well understood by most people. And so as a result, you're starting from a place of not really having anything understood. Whereas with science fiction, you can start from a modern understanding and move forward. With steampunk, you're kind of starting from nowhere. You can potentially back up from a modern setting, but it's not great. Maybe with the success of shows like Downton Abbey, you could start with something in that vein and then slowly ease into the more ridiculous technological innovations of a steampunk setting. Not sure. Maybe that would get you a hook at least. While I love steampunk, I do believe it remains the least accessible of these standard settings. So at the end of the day, is your setting accessible? Well, I think the best way to answer that question is to answer this question. How much do you have to explain to the player before they understand your setting? How much are they able to come in with an understanding of your setting and use that to basically skip to understanding? Do they already understand 95% of how this is going to work? That's a good thing. That's going to help them on board really quickly and not be confused. Do they need a primer on how steam boilers work? Then you've probably got a problem. But if you got your heart set on one of these less accessible settings, what do you do? How can you make it easier for your players to onboard? Well, the easiest thing to do is to give them something to use as an anchor. One way to do this is to make your setting a hybrid. Firefly is essentially a Western set in space. You can bring your expectations of how a Western works in terms of the role of law enforcement, in terms of a small group of people on their own, in terms of the way the firearms work, really in terms of even the visual aesthetics. And then they can layer on spaceflight on top of that. It doesn't answer all the questions super clear. I was never really incredibly clear on exactly how the interplanetary space travel worked, but it definitely gives you a very strong anchor to start with. Alternatively, you have the method of a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, where you put the character and the player into the same position, where neither understands the setting. This allows you to onboard the character and the player at the same time and slowly introduce your setting over a long period. This is exactly what something like Harry Potter does or Narnia does, where you start from the real world and then you move into ever increasing levels of fantastic as you add more things in. Similarly, you can just increase the oddness of your setting over time. If you really want to do steampunk, and I wish you all the luck in the world if you really want to do steampunk, start with something set in a pretty normal Victorian setting, which people basically understand, and then introduce the wacky scientist character who has a few weird gadgets. And then the main character and the wacky scientist stumble into a super science society, and then you introduce more and more of your setting over time, because this gives the player time to get used to each step along the way. The reality is that you can get a player to be interested in any setting as long as they're interested, as long as they're willing to pay attention. So the trick is to get them in the door in the first place and then keep them paying attention. So you need to be most concerned about what you're going to do in the first hour or two and what you're going to put in your marketing material that's going to make the game seem interesting and evocative and attractive to get people to invest the time that they're going to need to understand your more esoteric setting. And that's really the danger of the weirder settings, is that You just need more time. So if the game is great, people will give you that time. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link down in the description. If you found this interesting, please give this video a thumbs up. That will help YouTube know that it's getting some attention. If you can think of some other settings that I'm missing here, leave a comment down below and we can talk about them in the comments. You want to challenge my ranking? Go ahead. That's something that we can fight about in the comments as well. I will see you again soon. Thank you.